On building your very first PC, then you clicked on the right video. This is a full in-depth step-by-step build guide on not only building the PC, but also setting it up as well. Because building the PC is only the first half. You still have to set it up. We need to download and install the Windows operating system, download and install the drivers, set up XMP profile in the BIOS along with other Windows settings to make sure your PC is running at its full potential. We're going to be doing all of that in this video. If this is your first time building a PC and you don't quite have the confidence for it because maybe you're afraid of damaging something in the process, or maybe you're afraid of your PC not booting up for the first time, I'm here to tell you that it's gonna be okay. All right, I get it, you guys. This could be very intimidating for beginners. I've been there. I know what it feels like. That's why I'm gonna take my time in this video and guide you guys step by step from the very beginning all the way to the end. And I'm gonna make sure you do everything correctly. So these are all the parts I'll be using for this build guide, but don't freak out if your parts are completely different because building a PC is very similar. It doesn't matter if you're going Intel, AMD, or NVIDIA, okay? You can follow along on this build guide for whatever PC you're building yourself. But just in case, if you guys like this PC and you wanna build this exact same one, I'll drop a link to all the parts down below. All right, so before we begin the build guide, I think it's really important for you guys to understand what goes inside a PC and what each of these components do. Even if you've built a PC before, I'm pretty confident you might learn something new. So all PCs have 7 main components, and we're gonna start off with the CPU, also known as the central processing unit. It is kind of like the brain of the PC. It is the core component. It is responsible for processing and executing instructions to the rest of the components in the build. The CPU sits on the motherboard socket, another component needed for a functional PC. The motherboard is the backbone that ties the computer's components together at one spot and allows them to talk to each other. Think of the motherboard as the body. These come in various different sizes, ranging from tiny, mini ITX form factor all the way to extended ATX. They also come in different socket types and chipset. Next up is memory. Every PC needs at least one stick of RAM to function. Random access memory, or RAM, is one of the most important components in determining your system's performance. RAM gives applications a place to store and access data on a short-term basis. It stores the information your computer is actively using so that it can be accessed quickly. The frequency of the memory is just as important as the CL timing. Depending on your budget, you always want to go for the highest frequency possible with the lowest CL timing on memory, especially if you're building an AMD PC. That's because Ryzen systems run better on faster memory. The sweet spot you always want to aim for is at least 3200 MHz with a CL16 timing with 16 GB capacity. If your budget allows for faster RAM, try and get 3600 MHz CL16 memory. 16 GB is plenty for gaming in 2021. However, if you plan on using a PC as a workstation, for example, lots of multitasking and heavy application use like editing videos, 3D modeling, or any demanding program, then it would be a great idea to invest in more memory. Also, it's really good to keep in mind, if you decide to upgrade your memory later down the line, make sure you are buying the same exact memory that your current system has. Same capacity, same frequency, and the same CL timing to avoid performance issues. One of the most common mistakes I see in PC building all the time is that people don't enable XMP in the BIOS to take advantage of the memory's full speed. Your memory by default is running at half the frequency. In order to take advantage of the performance, you have to go into the BIOS and manually turn it on. If you want to check and see yourself if your memory is running at its full speed, go into your task manager, go into performance, click the memory, and check the speed of your memory. If you've always wondered why your PC is underperforming or running a lot slower than other PCs with similar specs, then 99% of the time it means that your XMP is not enabled in the BIOS. But don't worry, I'm going to show you guys how to do it correctly at the end of the video. It's kind of like buying a high refresh rate monitor and not going into the settings and changing it, because by default, most monitors come out of the box with a 60 Hz refresh rate. You have to actually go into the display settings and change the refresh rate yourself. Pretty much the same concept here. All right, moving on to the CPU cooler. A CPU cooler is optional in most cases. A lot of AMD CPUs come with a cooler already included. However, if your CPU does not, it is required to go with a capable cooler that will not only keep your CPU nice and cool, but also something that's quiet. If you're on a budget, I can leave a link to a few coolers that I recommend picking up. Alternatively, if your CPU does come with a cooler, but you want to get something nicer, maybe something with RGB lighting, then I'll drop some links to those coolers as well. For this video, I'll be going with the Corsair H150i Elite Caplix, which is an all-in-one liquid cooler that's going to look amazing in this build. Moving on to the most popular component in any PC, the GPU. To keep it simple and straightforward, the graphics card is what provides the graphics to your PC. The graphics card also determines how well your games run on your PC and how fast it renders out projects using GPU acceleration. The better the graphics card, the higher the frames per second in-game and faster render times. The higher the FPS in-game, the smoother your games will look and feel, bringing lots of joy and happiness. The graphics card I'm using for this build is a custom modded AMD RX 6800. This card is an ideal upgrade for gamers looking to play comfortably in 1440p or entry-level 4K gaming. And as you guys can see, I painted mine in white to stay consistent with the color scheme of the build. The power supply unit is the thing that provides power to all of your components. Using an insufficient power supply will cause many issues for your PC, like system instability and major crashes, not to mention no room for expandability or overclocking. It's always recommended to buy at least 100 watts more than what you need to cover future upgrades to your system. If you want to know how much power your PC needs, use the power supply calculator from Outer Vision. I'll drop a link to it down below. You also want to avoid buying cheap power supplies. You don't want to put a potato in your PC and have it potentially damage the rest of your components. Stick to well-known brands while going with a high efficiency rating as long as your budget allows it. There are also 3 types of power supplies: non-modular, semi-modular, and fully modular. Fully modular power supplies are more on the pricier side since all the cables are fully detachable, allowing you to plug in just the cables you need for the build. Semi-modular power supplies, on the other hand, only have a few detachable cables. Storage. Your PC definitely needs at least one source of storage that holds your operating system on. There are also different types of storage. M.2 SSDs are the smallest and usually the fastest drives out there, but also cost the most. Then we got traditional 2.5-inch SSDs and then hard drives, the slowest but cheapest options out there. I always recommend going with at least one M.2 or traditional SSD as your main drive, because not only will your PC boot faster to the desktop, but also any application or game you put on there will load up faster as well. Hard drives are really great for secondary or mass storage. The case is pretty self-explanatory. It holds all the parts together in a very stylish way. I'll be using the Corsair 5000X RGB full ATX tower to build this PC in because it looks amazing, offers great airflow, and has tons of support for fan and radiator configurations. So yeah, these are all the parts I'll be using for the build guide. Aside from these, this is also what you'll need to build a PC. A Phillips head screwdriver. I like to use an electric one for convenience, plus it comes with a magnetic work mat which helps me keep all the loose screws all in one place. An empty USB drive with at least 8 GB of space is needed so that we can download and install the Windows operating system for the PC. And speaking of the operating system, you will need to purchase a Windows key to activate your OS. It doesn't matter where you buy it from as long as you buy the correct version of the OS that matches the version we are going to download on the USB drive. There is a super cheap option on yourcdkey.com where you can pick one up for less than 20 bucks. Just make sure to use the code TS20 to get that extra discount. I've been using these guys for years on all of my PC builds on the channel. They are reliable and trustworthy. Also, make sure you guys are building on an even, flat surface, preferably a wooden tabletop if you have one. You don't have to worry about buying an anti-static wrist rest. I've built over 100 functioning PCs without one, so don't worry about that. It takes a lot of static to damage a PC component, so you guys are fine.
So, Adele, I was thinking... Oh, wait, hear me out. Shh, shut up. Yeah! So, where were we?
Boy, see it work.
Timing is everything in Raid Shadow Legends.
If you want to start PC gaming, we got you covered. Our PCs are designed to be well balanced and get you up in gaming for the low. What's so good about light PCs? Well, for one, we give you options. You can choose from one of our pre-built, custom PCs, or even opt in for a DIY if you're feeling a bit ballsy. If you want to go with a custom PC, you get to choose all the parts. We then charge a flat $99 build fee, and the PC arrives to you built and ready to plug in and play. That way, you still get to choose all your parts, but don't have to worry about bending a pin on the motherboard and tracking your full life savings. If you want to take on building your own PC, we also offer PC build kits. These kits include all the parts to build it yourself, as well as dedicated videos to walk you through the process. On top of all that, we know what you want. You want answers. So we show you the expected FPS and stream rating for every system. That way you know exactly what to expect for your money. We're not like the big guys. We want to get more people gaming and in the end, build a business doing that. We got your back and aim to make buying your PC easier and more affordable than ever. Start going. All right, chill. All right, number one, this thing is off, dude. This thing is gonna cause my death. My God. You gotta get up to speed a little bit more slowly. Good? I'm good. Restart it. I want to say light PCs. Jesus Christ. Yeah, you went to the side. Lift the forks a little bit. Yeah, lift them.
I'll do it over there.
We'll just lift them. Yeah.
We're having technical difficulties.
Go.
Hold on.
It started to drive. Yeah, there you go. We're giving you a lot of tasks here.
I know.
And ready to plug in and play. Get this damn thing out of my sight. All right, look out, Jeff. Don't worry, I got it under control here. My boxes. You're gonna have to walk it. Oh no! Still get to choose all your parts, but don't have to worry about bending a pin on the motherboard. I had a feeling that garbage was gonna be way too small.
You know, this isn't a hyperbole, you know?
Hyperbole, all right.
Hyperbole.
Yeah, it's a hyperbole.
That's what I said. It's hyperbole.
Yeah, it's a hyperbole.
Hyperbole, yeah. You know what I'm saying. Yeah, you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, I would say try to get like a little bit of an arc. Don't like beam them at me. Ready?
Yep.
If you want to take on building your own system, we also offer PC build kits. These kits include all. If you want to take on building your own system, we also offer PC build kits. These kits include everything you need to. PC build kits. These kits. You good? You saved it good. I want to be almost cut. I want to be almost like, I want it to be where at the end, I'm literally still trying to say what I need to say and I like, and can't keep up. Think on building your own PC. We also offer PC build kits. These kits include everything you need to build your own system, as well as dedicated parts. These kits include everything you need to build it yourself, as well as a dedicated build video to walk you through the process. Think on building your own PC. We also offer PC build kits. These kits include everything you need to build the PC yourself.
I'm trying to get back to my office.
Go. We've been a cut for like 2 minutes.
Get a question of love.
All right. Videos to walk you through. It's too late. You can start walking and sparking. All right. What do you? Yeah. Keep it up.
I didn't have it on yet.
Do you keep it in your head?
Yeah, keep him on.
We're not like the big guys. We want to get more people gaming, and in the end, build a business doing that. We get your back. We're not like the big guys. In the end, our goal is...
Our whole goal is to get you up and gaming on PC,
Pretty close.
and we're your friend. That's the end.
And we, your friend, is to make buying a PC easier and more affordable than ever. Get more people gaming, and in the end, build a business doing that. Our goal is to... I think I botched the beginning. Yeah, just turn that off.
But if you're building on your mother's dining table, I would recommend picking up a work mat, that way you don't damage the table. The last thing I want is for you guys to get the belt from your dad. It's better to be safe than sorry. But yeah, with all that covered, we are now ready to build the PC. Alright, so let's start off taking the motherboard and the rest of the accessories out of its box. Start off taking the motherboard with the plastic bag out of the box and placing it on the side. Underneath that, there will be a bunch of extra things that you will need. If your motherboard comes with a front panel connector extension, take that out as well. We're also going to take out the SATA cables. You will need one SATA cable for each storage device that you are installing. In my case, I'm installing an SSD, so I'll need a cable for that, and I'll need a second cable for the hard drive. If you're not installing an SSD or hard drive, then you don't need any of these cables. If your motherboard has a built-in Wi-Fi, then you will need to take out the Wi-Fi extender as well. We will need this to connect to the internet after the PC is built. If your motherboard comes with an M.2 installation screw, then take that out as well. You will need this to install your M.2 SSD. Now, if it doesn't come with one, then it means your motherboard already has this installed, so don't worry about it. You're also going to need the I/O shield if your motherboard comes with one. Otherwise, it's probably attached to your motherboard like it is in mine. And finally, we're going to take out the manual, as it can come in handy at times. Carefully remove the motherboard from its anti-static bag and be careful not to touch the components on the top and back. Make sure to grab the board from its sides. Afterwards, gently place it on top of the motherboard box. This will protect the board from getting damaged as we install the CPU, memory, and storage. We are now ready to install the CPU. Carefully open the CPU box and pull out the CPU from the protective case by holding it from its sides. Make sure not to touch the top surface of the CPU or the bottom, especially if you are using an AMD CPU, because the pins underneath the CPU can easily get bent, damaging the CPU in the process. Most CPUs have a triangle located on the corner. This indicates the direction you have to install the CPU onto the motherboard socket. I'm going to show you the process of installing 3 different CPUs. We have AMD, Intel, and AMD's Threadripper CPU as well. So identify the CPU you are installing and skip ahead to that part of the video using the timestamps listed on screen. Okay, so we're installing an AMD AM4 CPU. So grab the CPU by its sides and locate the golden triangle. Usually if you're looking directly at the CPU, it's on the bottom left. We're going to match that triangle to the triangle located on the motherboard socket. If you look closely on your AMD motherboard, you can see a triangle cut out on the top left corner of the socket. It's very small, but it is there. In my case, it's pointing to the top left corner. So I'm going to position the CPU so that the gold triangle from the CPU is also positioned in the top left corner. I'm basically matching the triangles together from the socket and the CPU. Afterwards, we're gonna have to lift the lever to the top. Do not force the lever as it can break easily. While grabbing the CPU from its sides, we're going to lower it down very gently onto the socket and let it fall in place. Do not touch the surface of the CPU and do not apply any force. Gravity should do the job and the CPU will naturally fall in place. Before moving on, check all 4 sides of the CPU and make sure it is fully seated on the socket. If everything looks good, gently lower the lever down, locking the CPU in place. Congratulations, you just installed your CPU. Pretty easy so far, right? Okay, so we're installing an Intel CPU. So grab the CPU by its sides and locate the golden triangle. Usually if you're looking directly at the CPU, it's on the bottom left, but this can vary depending on the socket type. Fun fact, the triangle is actually more larger on Intel CPUs compared to AMD's. If you look closely on your Intel motherboard, you can see a small triangle cut out on the socket cover. In my case, it's located on the bottom left. We're going to position the CPU so that the gold triangle from the CPU is also positioned in the bottom left corner. We're basically matching the triangles together from the socket and the CPU. Afterwards, we're going to slide the lever to the right and up to open the socket. While grabbing the CPU from the sides, we're going to gently lower it down onto the socket and let it fall in place. Do not touch the surface of the CPU and do not apply any force. Gravity should do the job and the CPU will naturally fall in place. If everything looks good, gently lower the cover down first so that the flap sits underneath the Torx screw. Afterwards, you can proceed to lower down the lever, locking the CPU in place. The black cover will pop off afterwards, but if it doesn't, just pull it off your CPU. Congratulations, you just installed your CPU. Pretty easy so far, right? Okay, so you're one of the very few elite out there to buy a Threadripper CPU. Let's get this baby installed. Obviously, you will need the CPU itself, but you'll also need the install tool that it comes with. It has an orange handle, so you can't miss it. Take your time to gently open the Threadripper box and slide out the CPU. I want you to enjoy this process because it is a very joyous occasion. Make sure not to touch the surface of the CPU or the bottom. Always grab the CPU from the sides. Notice there are numbers on the socket. It indicates the order of opening and closing the socket. So to open the socket, we will have to loosen the screws in this exact order: 3, 2, and 1. Okay, we are now ready to install the CPU. Grab the torque driver and start loosening up the socket in the order indicated. We're going to start from 3, then move over to 2, and finally socket number 1. The socket will spring open, so don't freak out. Go ahead and grab both of the blue tabs on the top and pull them up. We're also going to remove the gray protective piece that's on the socket. Now this part is a little tricky. You have to gently slide in the CPU against the rails, but make sure to do it slowly so that it doesn't derail and pop off the bracket. Here's another angle of the installation. We are starting from the top and slowly sliding the CPU down against the rail. Once the CPU is safely on the bottom, we are ready to lower the CPU down onto the socket. While you're holding down on the blue tabs, lower the entire CPU down until you hear it click. Then we can lower the top bracket. And as you're holding it down, we can tighten the bracket in place by going backwards. Remember we did 3, 2, 1 to open it. Now we're doing 1, 2, 3 to lock it. Make sure to tighten each screw all the way until you hear the tool click. Don't be afraid to use some force until you hear the click. That's it, you officially installed a Threadripper CPU. Congrats. Pretty easy so far, right? Okay, we are now ready to move on to the memory installation. Most mainstream motherboards have 4 DIMM slots, one for each memory stick you are installing. If you're installing 4 memory sticks, then you can just fill up all the slots. But if you're installing 2, then you will need to install them in the correct slots to take advantage of dual channel. Most boards will have a diagram labeled right on the motherboard next to the DIMM slots. This will tell you what slots you need to occupy first. If it's not labeled on your motherboard, you can find it in your manual. So if you're installing 2 memory sticks, you need to install the first stick in slot A2 and the second stick into slot B2. First thing we need to do is remove the tabs on the slots that you are going to install the memory in. So if we're installing 2 memory sticks, for example, we are going to open up the tabs from slot number 2 and slot number 4. Every memory stick has a gap in the middle, as you can see here. We are going to align the gap on the memory to the notch on the DIMM slot. Once we have the correct orientation of the RAM, lower the memory stick down and apply firm pressure to snap it in place. If you successfully install the RAM stick, then the tabs on the sides will be closed. So double check your memory and make sure all the sticks are properly seated. If your motherboard has 8 DIMM slots, then just follow the same process for each one. Alright, we can take this time to install our M.2 SSD. If you're not installing any in your PC, feel free to skip on to the next section. Most motherboards will have 1 or more M.2 slots, mostly located in between the PCI slots of the motherboard. In some cases, your M.2 slot can be behind your motherboard as well. This is very common in smaller form factor motherboards. You always want to install your M.2 SSDs on the top slot. Some M.2 SSDs come with its very own heatsink. As you can see here, the Corsair MP600 does have one in fact.
After a busy day, dinner time is such a sweet moment for our family to pause and come together. My new collection is full of earth-tone pieces and inviting details to help you celebrate time spent around the table.
What's the one thing the world's top MSPs have in common? They get done. They mitigate risks, action opportunities, and create better outcomes.
But the motherboard has an M.2 cover already installed, so unfortunately, you can't use both. You have to make a decision and decide what you want to go with. If you want to go with the motherboard's cover, then simply detach the heatsink from your M.2 SSD and proceed with the video. If you want to keep the heatsink on, then do nothing and proceed with the video. We're gonna need these tiny screws that came with your motherboard. Go ahead and unscrew the cover off the top M.2 SSD slot and put it to the side. If you look closely on the actual M.2 slot, you can see a notch, very similar to the memory sticks we just installed. We are going to align that notch with the gap on your M.2 SSD for the correct orientation. Once you identify where the notch is, simply insert the M.2 SSD into the slot and push down on the other end so you can finish tightening it using the small screws. If you're using the motherboard cover, make sure to peel off the plastic from the thermal pad before putting it back on top of the M.2 SSD, and then you can tighten it back up. If you have more than one M.2 SSD, just follow the same steps for each additional one you're installing. Alright, we are now ready to prep the motherboard for the cooler installation. I'm going to show you how to install a stock AMD cooler, and I'm also going to show you how to install an all-in-one cooler, also known as an AIO. Most coolers have thermal paste already pre-applied, as you can see here. If your cooler already has some, then there is no need to add your own thermal paste. However, if your cooler doesn't have any thermal paste, then we're gonna have to add some to the CPU before installing your cooler. Thermal paste is really important to help transfer the heat from the CPU to the cooler. Without it, the CPU will overheat and can potentially get damaged. I'm going to show you two different ways of applying thermal paste. First off, locate the thermal paste inside your cooler box and take it out. If for some reason your cooler doesn't have any thermal paste included, you can buy them online for super cheap. I'll leave a link down below to one that I highly recommend. The P-dot method is the most simple and common way of applying thermal paste. You squeeze a tiny amount right in the center of the CPU, and once you install the cooler, it will help spread it across the IHS. I recommend this method for beginners. The spread method is personally my favorite method, and it's the way I apply thermal paste on all of my PC builds. To do this, you will need a thermal paste spatula, which is sold separately. After applying a tiny amount of thermal paste in the center of the CPU, I use the spatula to evenly spread the paste across the IHS, making sure the entire surface is covered. I do this because I like the peace of mind knowing that the entire surface is covered by thermal paste. If in any case you messed up the thermal paste application and you need to clean your CPU, make sure you are using 99% isopropyl alcohol and paper towel. Do not use any tissue or toilet paper, as those will leave fibers behind. Remove the CPU from the motherboard and add a little bit of isopropyl to the tip of your paper towel. You can then use it to wipe off the thermal paste from the surface of your CPU. It's okay if there is some thermal paste left on the sides of the CPU. It's not a huge deal, but if you want, you can clean the edges as well. You can also use the paper towel and the isopropyl to clean the paste off of your cooler if you need to. Now that we know how to apply thermal paste and clean the CPU, we are ready to install the cooler. If you're installing an AIO, skip to the AIO installation part of the video. Otherwise, if you're installing the stock cooler on either AMD or Intel, then listen up. Your AMD motherboard will have two of these brackets already pre-installed. We're gonna have to remove them in order to install the stock cooler. Use a Phillips screwdriver and remove all 4 of the screws holding the bracket in place. Do not remove the bracket behind the motherboard. We actually need that to install the cooler. We're going to align the 4 screws from the cooler to the 4 holes on the motherboard. This is the same for Intel motherboards using the stock cooler, by the way. The cooler can only be installed in 2 directions. It doesn't matter which direction you install the cooler as long as there is clearance. Sometimes the memory sticks will block the cooler on certain motherboards. Unfortunately, that is the case for me. As you can see, the memory stick is a little too close and it's coming in contact with the AMD logo on the cooler. If this happens to you, just flip the direction of the cooler to the other side. Once the cooler is sitting on top of the CPU, we are ready to tighten it. Using the same screwdriver, we are going to tighten the screws in a crisscross pattern. Make sure all the screws are fully tightened all the way before moving on. There is a cable that comes out of the cooler. This has to be plugged into the CPU fan header on the motherboard. In most cases, it is located on the top right side of the board and it's labeled CPU_fan. After plugging in the cable, you can take this time to cable manage. I like to tuck the cable underneath the cooler next to the RAM sticks, that way it doesn't stick out. Alright, if you're installing an AIO, take the following items out of the box: the AIO unit itself, and the following bags of accessories. You're gonna have to look for the bags that has your CPU and socket type labeled right on it. It's really easy to figure out which of these you're gonna need. The socket type is located right on your CPU box. For Intel CPUs, it's usually right on the face of the box near the bottom. As you can see, mine says LGA 1151, so we're gonna be using the bag that has Intel 1151 labeled on it. For AMD CPUs, it's most likely on the back of the box where the sticker is. If it says AM4, we're gonna use the AM4 bag. And finally, for Threadripper, it's an obvious one. You're gonna need the bag that says STR4. For the sake of the video, we are going to use the bag that says AM4 since I'm using an AM4 CPU. You will need to take out the mounting brackets along with both of the tightening screws. You're also going to need to take out the other bag that has all of the installation screws. Locate the pump of your AIO and take off the protective cover. Whatever you do, just make sure not to touch any of the thermal paste that's already applied on there. If you do, you might have to wipe it off and apply some new thermal paste. If you're using an Intel CPU, then you can keep the same bracket on, but if you're using a different CPU like AMD or even Threadripper, then you're gonna have to take that bracket off. Remember the bag you selected earlier with your socket type written on it? Well, you're gonna need to use those brackets with your AIO. If you're using a different cooler compared to mine in this video, then you might have to attach the brackets to the pump using screws that they provide. But this specific cooler that I'm using in the video doesn't require any screws, and I can just slide them on, as you can see. As always guys, for more information, refer to the manual of your AIO that you're installing. Alright, once the correct brackets are installed on the pump, we can put the cooler off to the side for now and proceed with the motherboard installation. If your motherboard doesn't have a built-in IO shield, then you're gonna have to install this piece in your case before we put the motherboard in.
Spooky! You don't want to run into this pumpkin. Harvest Jack is one scary champion. Want to see him shine? Put him in the arena. His fear ability turns good to bad and bad to worse. He can take a hit too. He's got a lot of health. The more health this guy has, the stronger he is. With his scythe and glowing eyes, Harvest Jack is scary. You want him on your side. Get him in Raid Shadow Legends and terrify your competition.
Raid Shadow Legends. Download now and play for free.
Going back in style doesn't have to break the bank. With great prices on trending denim and school day essentials, you get the best and nothing less. Plus, earn Kohl's Cash. More style, more savings. Only at Kohl's.
Locate the rectangular cutout in the back of your case and install the IO shield from the inside while making sure the circle cutouts are near the bottom. Apply pressure from the inside on all 4 corners until the IO shield snaps in place. It should sit flush with the case as you can see here. Remove the back cover of your PC and pull out the box or bag that has all the installation screws and accessories. It's usually located in your hard drive cage near the bottom. We're gonna need to take out the motherboard installation screws. They are usually labeled right on the bag, but if they aren't, they usually look like this. You will need 1 screw for every hole in your motherboard. The number of holes depends on the size of your motherboard. As you can see, my motherboard has 9 holes, so I will need 9 screws. Unless there is a peg standoff in the middle of the case, in that case you will need 1 less screw. So before you install the motherboard, we gotta make sure the case has standoffs. In most cases, the standoffs are already pre-installed, but if yours doesn't come with any, then you have to put them on yourself. This is what the standoffs look like, and you will need 1 for every hole on your motherboard, because these standoffs are what the motherboard gets secured onto. Once the standoffs are installed in the correct places, you are ready to put in the motherboard. Make sure to lay your case flat on your desk. Grab the motherboard by its sides and gently lower it down onto the case while making sure the IO shield in the back goes in first. Make sure to align the holes on the motherboard with the standoffs on the case. You can go ahead and secure the motherboard to the case by using the motherboard screws. Alright, so before we continue any further, we have to figure out the fan configuration of your PC. And if you're using an AIO, we have to figure out the orientation of that as well. Let's start with the fan configuration. And to help illustrate this, I'm going to show you an empty case. So the rule of thumb here is that you always want to have neutral pressure in your case. This means the air pressure in the case is equal to the air pressure outside of the case. Usually this means the same amount of intake and exhaust fans. If that's not possible with your fan configuration, then you should at least aim for a positive pressure. This means more air is being pushed into your case than being pulled out. What you don't want is negative pressure. More air being pulled out of the case than being pulled in. In order to set up the perfect fan configuration for your PC, you need to understand how to position the fans. If you look closely, you can see arrows on the side of the fans. The direction the arrow is pointing determines the direction of the airflow. For example, if the arrow is pointing to the top, that means the fan is pulling air in from the bottom and out to the top. If the arrow is pointing to the left, that means the air is traveling from the right to the left and so on and so forth for all the other directions. A lot of fans out there actually don't have any arrows on the sides. In that case, you have to look at the fan and determine which direction the airflow is. Always remember this term, faces suck. The face of the fan is always where the air is getting sucked in from. So if the face is on the right side, then the direction of the airflow is right to left. If the face is on the bottom, then the direction of the airflow is bottom to top, so on and so forth. Here is what I recommend for your fan configuration using however many fans you have. If you have only 1 fan, I would place it in the front of your case for intake, and I would place it somewhere in the middle, that way the air goes through your GPU and escapes from the top. For 2 fans, it's pretty simple. 1 for intake and 1 for exhaust. You can place the exhaust on either the top or the rear of your case. The choice is yours. For triple fans, I would place 2 fans as intake and 1 for exhaust. Again, either on the top or the rear of your PC. 4 fans is also really simple. 2 in the front for intake and 2 for exhaust. I would place 1 on the top and 1 on the rear for aesthetics. If you have 5 fans, I would place 3 as intake in the front and 2 as exhaust. And finally, if you have 6 fans, you can place 3 in the front as intake and the rest as exhaust. Now, if you have more than 6 fans, just follow the same concept as above to make sure the pressure is balanced in your case. If you have an AIO or an all-in-one cooler, the same concept applies. The only difference here is that you would have a radiator in the front or the back of the fans. And we'll get more into the AIO orientation in a little bit. You never want to mount intake on the top because hot air rises. Intake should always be on the bottom of your case or in the front. And in some cases like the Lian Li, you can even mount it towards the back. Exhaust fans should always be on the top or the back of your case. The absolute minimum amount of fans I would recommend in your PC is at least 2. If you can get 4, that would be great, but the very minimum, try and get at least 2 fans in your case, one for intake and one for exhaust. Alright, now it's time to figure out the orientation of your radiator. There are really 4 ways you can mount your AIO. 2 positions on the top and 2 positions on the front. Let's start with the top. This is the most common way of installing an AIO. Not only is it the most aesthetically pleasing, in my opinion of course, but it's also a great way to prolong the life of your AIO. You can have the tubes running down from the right side of the case or the left side. It depends on your preference. However, whatever you do, make sure that the tubes from the pump are facing the right side if you can. As you can see in this video, I have the tubes running down from the right side and into the right side of the pump. In my previous build, I had the tubes running down the left side, but the tubes from the pump are still on the right. If you're installing the radiator in the front of your case, then listen up, because there is a wrong way of doing this that can damage the pump and shorten the lifespan of your AIO. To start off, you can position a radiator with the tubes coming out from the bottom. Now, this is the safest method in prolonging the life of your AIO, but this is also the ugliest method. If you're building inside a closed side panel case, then I would recommend going with this method since you can't really see it from the outside anyways. But if you're building a good looking system, I would avoid this and flip the radiator so that the tubes are coming out from the top. If you're doing it this way, just make sure the pump is below the top of the radiator. If the pump is above the radiator, then that means the air will get trapped into the pump, making it difficult to push the liquid through the loop, and this can damage and shorten the life of the AIO. So to recap, this method is safe as long as the pump is below the top of the radiator. Position number 1 is the safest. Position number 2 is okay but not recommended. Position 3 is not recommended as it can damage the pump and shorten the lifespan of your AIO. Now that we figure out the best position of the AIO, there are different ways you can mount it with the fans. Either the fans in the front or the fans in the back, and this will mostly depend on your preference and the case design. You can also do a push and pull configuration with the fans in the front and back, assuming you do have the extra fans to support this. In this case, the fans in the front are pushing air through the radiator while the fans in the back are pulling them, hence why it's called a push and pull configuration. Go ahead and select where you want to install your radiator, either in the front or the top. If you're just installing fans, then skip to the fan portion of the video. Alright, so you decided to install the radiator in the front of your case. If you have fans in the front of the case like I do, it makes sense to install the radiator in the back, that way you are not covering the fans in the front. Some cases have a removable bracket like the one I'm using in this video, which makes it really easy to install a radiator on. Just find the thumb screws that are holding it in place and remove them. That way you can take off the entire bracket, install the AIO, and then put it back in. But if your case doesn't have a removable bracket, then continue on with the video. Carefully remove the front panel of your case and the dust filter if there is one. Run the cables through the case and out the back. You can use these longer screws to hold the fan in place temporarily. Once you have all the fans hooked up in the front temporarily, bring in the radiator from the back slowly while making sure the fans don't move around. While you're holding up the radiator with your beefy arms, you have to tighten the screws from the front. This part is really difficult and it's pretty hard to do by yourself, so if you can find someone to hold the radiator for you as you tighten the screws from the front, that would be great. Otherwise, just hang in there. Once all the fans are hooked up to the radiator, you are ready to move on to the next step, so please skip over to the following timestamp. Alright, so you decided to install the radiator on the top of your case. The best fan configuration for this would be exhaust, so the face of the fans are going to be visible from the bottom. We're going to install the fans on the radiator first, so grab your fans and place them flat on the radiator so that the front of the fans are visible. You also want to make sure to position the cables towards the back, that way you can run the cables through the back of the case once installed. Make sure to align the fan holes with the holes on the radiator. You're going to need 4 of these longer screws with 4 washers for each fan you are installing. So if you're installing 2 fans, you'll need 8 of each. If you're installing 3 fans, you will need 12 of each. Insert the washer through the long screw and slide it through the fan. Make sure you're not over tightening these. Once all the fans are hooked up to the radiator, we are ready to install this in the case. We're gonna need 4 of these smaller screws for each fan that we installed on the radiator. Go ahead and remove the top panel of your case and the dust filter if you have one. Obviously your case may vary, so just remove whatever part you have to in order to get access to the top mounting bracket of your case. It's a lot easier to run the cables from the fans through the cutout near the top of your case before bringing in the radiator. Once all the cables are through the case, I like to grab onto them from the opposite side and pull on them as I bring the radiator in. That way none of the cables are stuck inside the case. So while you're holding onto the radiator with your other hand, use your main hand to screw the radiator in place. It's a great idea to tighten one screw on the top left and one screw on the bottom right. That way you can at least hold up the radiator while you finish screwing in the rest of the holes. As I mentioned before, we don't need to apply thermal paste since the cooler already has some, but if you need to apply thermal paste, go back and watch this part of the video. Alright, we are now ready to finish installing the AIO. You're gonna need 2 of these thumb screws and 2 of these fisheye screws. Obviously this will vary based on your AIO. Insert the fisheye screw from the bottom and the thumb screw from the top, but don't fully tighten it just yet. Do the same thing for the other side. The fisheye part of the screw is going to lock onto the bracket from the motherboard. Grab the pump with the tubes facing the right side and slowly move it close to the CPU. Start by tilting the pump towards the top first so that the top fisheye hooks onto the top bracket first. And afterwards, you can lower the bottom part of the pump and do the same thing for the bottom bracket. Afterwards, you can lower the bottom part of the pump and do the same thing for the bottom bracket. Once both brackets are hooked on, you can proceed to tighten them. Just make sure you are tightening them evenly. Depending on what AIO you are using, you're gonna have to plug the cables into certain things. If you're not using the same AIO as me in the video, please look through your manual and figure out where to plug your cables in. But for the most part, it's very similar. If you're using the same AIO, then follow along. The shorter, thin cable plugs into the motherboard's pump header, if you have one. Here's a quick diagram to help you figure out where to plug in your cables in the future. Generally, it's a good idea to plug your AIO pump into the AIO pump header on your motherboard, because that always runs at max speed, which is exactly what you want your pump to do. The fans, on the other hand, plug into the CPU fan header on the board instead. The CPU fan header allows you to control the fan speeds through the BIOS and any compatible software in Windows. If your motherboard doesn't have an AIO pump header, then you could plug in your AIO cable into any other fan header instead, but you have to go into BIOS and change the fan settings to max speed when you get a chance. The other thicker cable plugs into the Commander Core RGB unit that the AIO comes with. Since we have the Commander Core unit and all Corsair fans, we're going to take advantage of this and plug in all of our Corsair fans in it. Every Corsair fan has 2 cables coming out of it, one for RGB and the other for fan speed, also known as the 4-pin fan cable. Luckily, the Commander Core can support up to 6 Corsair fans. On one side there are 6 ports for RGB, and on the other we have 6 ports for the 4-pin cable. You don't have to plug them in now since we'll go over that in the cable portion later in this video, but it's something to keep in mind. Alright, so now it's time to install your fans in the case. If you aren't installing any fans, skip over to the next section of the video. You're going to need 4 of these thicker screws for each fan you're installing. Make sure you have the correct position of your fans before doing anything. Remember guys, faces suck. You can always refer back to the fan configuration section of the video if you need more help. Go ahead and attach the fan to the mounting bracket of your case and screw it in place from the other side. I also decided to add one more exhaust fan in the back of the case because my OCD won't allow the empty space to exist. So I'm going to repeat the same process here. I'm going to run the cables through the case first and then attach the fan on the back. As I'm holding it with my right hand, I'm going to use my left hand to screw the fan in place from the back. You guys are doing great so far. Keep it up. Alright, so now that we have all the fans installed, we are ready to hook up the power supply. So go ahead and take that out of the box along with the bag of zip ties and screws. We're also going to need the main power cable, so you can put this aside for now. And finally, the bag of disconnected cables, unless you're using a non-modular power supply, in which case all the cables are already hooked up to your power supply. So we need to figure out what cables you're going to need. So let's go over them real quick. So the first and mandatory cable you're gonna need is the 24-pin ATX cable. This provides power to the entire board. It is the biggest cable, so it's also hard to miss. The next cable you will need is the EPS cable, which sends power to the CPU socket. Every motherboard has at least an 8-pin EPS socket that is usually located on the top left. Some boards also have an extra 4-pin, and others might even have an extra 8-pin. You don't need to plug in all the cables. You just need the 8-pin EPS that delivers up to 235 watts of power to the CPU, which is more than enough even for light overclocking. You shouldn't worry about the extra EPS sockets unless you are using a high core count CPU like a 10 core or higher, and if you're planning on doing heavy overclocking. Otherwise, the single 8-pin is more than enough. Now, if you have the extra APS cables from your power supply, then it's always best to plug that in regardless. I mean, if you have them anyways, might as well use them. You're also going to need a PCIe cable. This provides power to your graphics card. It's usually labeled PCIe on the connector itself. Your power supply always comes with at least one of these PCIe cables, and it's usually split into two 8-pin cables, as you can see here. So you should have a total of 16 pins. In order to find out how many you need for your graphics card, you have to locate the PCI connector on it and count the number of holes it has. As you can see, my graphics card has two 8-pin connectors for a total of 16, so one cable is all I need. The rest of the cables are optional. They are not required unless you have devices that need these cables. A Molex cable is needed to supply power to certain devices. This could be anything from non-RGB fans to fan hubs or other devices with a 4-pin. If anything has 4 pins that can plug into these, then you're gonna need this cable for your build. This next cable is also optional, but it's actually more commonly used in PCs. This is the SATA power cable, and it also provides power, but to SATA-based devices. This is commonly used to power AIO pumps, fan hubs, and storage devices. You're going to need one SATA connector for each SSD and hard drive you are putting in your PC. Usually one cable is enough since it has 3 or 4 SATA plugs on it. If you're not using a fully modular power supply, go ahead and skip over to the next section of the video. Okay, so now we are ready to plug in the cables that we need for the PC. Every power supply cable will have labels right next to the connectors so that you know where to plug these in. Don't worry about plugging these cables in the wrong way because all of these plug in only one way. You can't mess this up even if you tried. So let's start off with the easy one, the 24-pin ATX cable. Grab the side that is split into 2 separate connectors. Keep this in mind, by the way. If you see the words PSU or type labeled on the side of the connector, that is the side that plugs into the power supply unit. As you can see, my cables have the words type labeled on the side, so I know that these plug into the power supply. Make sure the clip is facing the hole on the power supply before connecting it. Afterwards, just double check the clip and make sure that the cable is plugged in all the way. Next, we can install the EPS cables. The side labeled CPU goes into the motherboard, and the other side plugs into the power supply. This cable goes into the socket labeled either CPU, EPS, or 4+4 CPU. In some power supplies like mine, the EPS and PCI cables have the same connection on the power supply side, so it doesn't really matter where you plug these in. Just make sure to count the number of pins and match that with the number of holes in the power supply. And finally, the Molex and SATA power cables all plug into the part labeled peripheral and SATA. All of these connections have a 6-pin connector, and that's how you're able to tell the difference. So I'm going to quickly swap over some custom cables that I ordered from CableMod because custom cables do look a lot better than stock cables. So if you're wondering why they look different than the cables we just plugged in, that's why. Alright, now it's time to install the power supply in the case. Most power supplies are located on the rear back side of the case. You'll need to remove the rear side panel to gain access. If you're using a case that allows you to remove the power supply bracket on the back, then go ahead and take it out and install it on the back of your power supply. If it doesn't, then we're going to have to put in the power supply from the side. You always want to position the fan of the power supply so it's facing the ventilation of the case. As you can see here, the vents are on the bottom. So I'm going to position the power supply with the fan facing down. That way you can pull in fresh cold air from the bottom. But we do have a slight issue here. As you can see, the hard drive cage is a little too close to the power supply and there isn't enough room for the cables. You might run into the same exact problem. So what we're going to do here is we're going to move the hard drive cage over to the left. In most cases, you are able to remove or reposition the hard drive cage. There are usually a few thumb screws holding it down. You just have to loosen those and then you can move the hard drive cage over or completely remove it if you're not installing any hard drives. As you can see, now we have extra space for the cables. In the bag we pulled out earlier from the power supply box, you will find 4 of these screws. These are needed to secure the power supply to the case from the back. Now before we get into the fun stuff, which is plugging in all the cables, we should take this time to plug in our storage devices. Go ahead and select what storage device you are installing in your PC. If you're not installing anything, skip over to the following section of the video. Before we install the hard drive, it's important to understand what cables are needed and how to plug them in. So the connections on the hard drive are located in the back. The smaller SATA cable plugs into the smaller port. The larger SATA power cable plugs into the larger port in the back. Very simple. The other end of the black SATA cable plugs into the SATA port on your motherboard, often located on the right edge of the board, usually underneath the larger 24 pin. I'll talk more about this later in the video. Alright, so now that we know how to plug in a hard drive, we are ready to install that inside the case. Locate your hard drive cage, which is usually on the bottom underneath the power supply cover. Go ahead and pull out one of the hard drive trays from the back. There are 2 ways you can hook up your hard drive to the tray. The first method is by using the 4 holes on the tray. You would just need to align these with the 4 holes on the back of the hard drive and screw them in place using these tiny screws. The second method is the one I prefer since it is the easiest and it doesn't require any tools. So there are 4 pegs attached on the inside of the tray, as you can see here. You just have to insert these pegs into the holes located on the side of the hard drive. Just insert one side of the hard drive in first and then the other. Make sure the connectors of the hard drive is facing towards the back, by the way, so that you can plug in the cables easily once you install this back inside the hard drive cage. Afterwards, you can slide the hard drive tray back into the drive cage and plug in the cables. Installing the SSD is pretty much the same as the hard drive. You can also install the SSD in any hard drive tray if you don't have any additional SSD trays. You just align the holes from the tray with the back of the SSD and you screw it in place. If you don't want to install it in a hard drive tray, you can install it in an SSD tray instead. These are smaller trays specifically designed for SSDs. Most cases do come with at least one SSD tray and others come with multiple. It's also very easy to spot. In most cases, they are attached on the back of the case, and in some other cases, you can find them on the top of the power supply shroud instead. Make sure the connectors are facing the back of the tray and align the SSD so that the screw holes are visible from the opposite side. You're going to need these smaller screws to secure the SSD to your tray. The smaller SATA cable plugs into the smaller connection port in the back of the SSD. The larger SATA power cable plugs into the larger connection in the back. Very simple. At this time, you can install the tray back into your case before we finish up plugging the cables. The other end of the black SATA cable plugs into the SATA port on your motherboard. Before we install the graphics card, we should take this time to plug in the rest of the cables. Let's go ahead and start off with the cables from the case. These cables are often grouped up together in the back of your PC, so go ahead and locate them and separate the cables. We're going to start off with the easy ones. Grab the cable that looks like this. In most cases, it usually has a blue tip instead. This cable is for the USB 3 ports in the front of your case. If your case doesn't have any USB 3 ports, then you won't have this cable.
Oh, when you take me by the hand, I feel better again. Oh, I feel better now.
The USB 3 cable plugs into the USB 3 header on your motherboard. This can be in 2 locations, either on the side of the motherboard right underneath the 24 pin or near the bottom. It is labeled JUSB 3. You're going to make sure the notch on the connector aligns with the gap from the port. Be very careful plugging this in as you can easily bend and damage the pins. Also make sure that the cable is all the way in. If you have any additional USB ports on your case, then you'll also have this cable. It will have the words USB written right on the tip. This cable plugs into the USB header on your board, which is usually on the bottom. You can spot which header it is by the JUSB header. In most cases, if your board has multiple headers, then there will be a number next to it, like JUSB 1 and JUSB 2. It doesn't matter which one you plug it in, just make sure the pins match with the holes on the cable. You can also just have the words USB facing the top before you plug it in. If for any reason you don't have enough USB headers on your motherboard, you are going to need to buy an extension hub. This is very common on a lot of boards where they only provide you with one USB header. So if you have devices that require 2 or more, then you have to buy an adapter. If you just need one extra USB hub, I would buy this one. It costs only $8 and it will give you an extra USB hub. You would just have to plug this into your only USB header on your motherboard. Now, if you need up to 3 more, then I recommend going with this one instead. It also plugs into your USB header, but it will give you an extra 3 ports. Personally, I would recommend buying this regardless because if you decide to upgrade your PC later down the line, you will have the extra ports there just in case you need to use them. I'll drop a link to both of these down below. The next cable we are plugging in is labeled audio. This is to connect the front audio and mic jack connectors from your case to your motherboard so that they can be used. This cable plugs into the audio header on your motherboard, usually on the bottom left corner. It is labeled JAUD1. Make sure the pins match with the connector before inserting it in. Another way to remember this is by having the words from the cable face the top and make sure the cable is all the way in. If you have any USB-C ports on the front panel of your case, then you will have a USB-C cable as well, which looks like this. The cable plugs into the USB-C header on your motherboard. This can either be right underneath the 24 pin or somewhere near the bottom of your motherboard. The port looks like this and it's usually labeled USB 3.1 or U31. There is no wrong way of connecting this cable as it goes in both ways, just like my friend Harry. Before we move on to the power supply cables, let's take this time to plug in all of your fans and the fan hubs if you have any. If you're using the same AIO cooler as I am, then follow along. Otherwise, you can skip over to the next portion of the video. The Corsair Caplux cooler comes with its very own Commander core, which allows you to plug up to 6 Corsair RGB fans into it. We're going to plug in all 3 of the intake fans and 3 of the exhaust fans into the Commander core. The 4-pin fan cable plugs into the fan side. The RGB cable plugs into the other side. The thin cable from the pump plugs into the AIO pump header of your motherboard. But if your board doesn't have any pump headers, you can plug this into any fan header. The thicker cable plugs into the Commander core unit. Now let's move on to the Commander core. The unit has 2 cables attached to it. The one that's labeled USB plugs into the USB header on your motherboard. Remember where that was? It's located on the bottom of your board, usually labeled JUSB1, JUSB 2, and so on, depending on how many you have. The other cable is a SATA power cable. This plugs into the female SATA power cable from the power supply. If you're not using the same cooler, but you still have 6 fans to connect, then you can use the integrated fan hub behind the case. It's pretty much another Commander core unit built in. The concept is the same. You plug in all of your 4-pin fan cables on the fan hub located on the left, and the RGB cables on the RGB hub on the right. Any additional fans you have in your case need to be plugged into the fan headers of your motherboard. Any of these headers will work for your case fans. However, if your motherboard doesn't have enough headers for all of your fans, you will need to buy a fan hub. I'll drop a link below to a few I personally recommend. This will give you more fan headers to plug in all of your fans in the case. If you need up to 5 extra headers, I recommend picking this one up. It costs only $8 and it will give you the option of plugging in up to 5 fans. You just need to plug in the other end to any of the fan headers on your motherboard. If you need more than 5 extra fan headers, then I would recommend going with this option instead. However, keep in mind that in addition to plugging the other end to a fan header on your motherboard, you would need to supply power to it using one of your Molex cables. The last set of cables we're plugging in from the case are these tiny pins. You will either have all of these or only some of them. These cables plug in the JFP1 header on the bottom of your motherboard. If you look closely, this header has a total of 9 pins. There are 4 on the top and 5 on the bottom. Remember that and look at this diagram for additional help. We can start with the power LED plus and the minus cables. The power LED plus plugs into the very first pin on the top row. The power LED minus plugs into the second pin from the top row, right next to the plus. Next, grab the power SW cable. This connects the power switch from your case to the motherboard so that you can use it. This one plugs in right next to the previous cable in pins number 3 and 4, but make sure the words are facing down. Here's what the top row should look like from the bottom. As you can see, we have the power LED plus and the minus followed by the power switch with the words facing down. Now we are going to move down to the second row of pins. Let's start off with the HDD LED. Just like the previous cable, we are going to flip this upside down so that the text is facing down, and we're going to plug this into pins number 1 and number 2 from the bottom row. The last and final cable we are plugging in is the Reset SW. This connects the reset switch from your case to the motherboard. If your case doesn't have a reset switch, then obviously you won't have this cable. So this cable plugs in directly next to the HDD LED in pins number 3 and number 4 in the same direction. Make sure the words are facing down. Here are what your cable should look like from the bottom. As you can see, we have the HDD LED first, followed by the Reset SW. Pretty simple, right? Now we are ready to plug in the rest of the cables from the power supply. Let's go ahead and start off with the big boy cable, the 24 pin. It's pretty obvious where this one plugs in. It's the only big socket on the motherboard, often located on the right side. Make sure the clip side of the cable is facing towards the right. That way it can lock in. It's really important that you guys make sure the cable is fully seated. This means the clip has to go over the lip. Next, we are ready to connect the EPS cables. So grab the cable that is labeled CPU and plug this into the 8-pin socket on the top left of your board. Again, make sure the clip sits over the lip to avoid any issues with your system. On some other boards, the 8-pin EPS socket is located on the right side, but it's always near the top of the motherboard. If your motherboard has an extra 4-pin connector, you can plug that cable in as well if you want. It's not required, but if you have the extra cable for it, might as well. You should be able to split one of your extra 8-pin EPS cables in half, converting it into dual 4-pin cables. If your power supply doesn't have the extra 8-pin EPS cable, then don't worry about it. Your PC will still function normally without the extra cable. If your motherboard has dual 8-pin EPS connectors and you do have an extra 8-pin EPS cable, then go ahead and plug that in. But once again, if you don't have the extra 8-pin EPS cable, then it's fine. Your PC will still function normally. You just won't be able to do any heavy overclocking. Take this time to plug in any of your storage devices that you might have missed. Remember, the SATA power cable plugs into the larger port behind your SSD or hard drive, and the smaller black SATA cable plugs into the smaller port. The other end of the SATA cable plugs into the SATA port of your motherboard, usually located on the bottom right. Also, if you have any devices that require a Molex cable, plug those in right now as well. We don't have any for this specific build, so I'm going to skip this portion. If you have any RGB devices, you will need to plug these into the 3-pin or 4-pin RGB headers on your motherboard. Make sure to count the number of holes from your cable before plugging anything in. The number of holes must match the number of pins on your motherboard. And finally, we are ready to install the graphics card. Make sure you are installing the GPU on the highest PCI slot on your motherboard for the best performance. We're going to remove the PCI bracket from the back of the case that corresponds with the top PCI slot. Depending on how thick your card is, you might have to remove additional PCI brackets. For most mainstream GPUs, you would just need to remove only 2 PCI brackets. Once the PCI brackets are removed, we are now ready to plug in the graphics card. Remove any protective cover your GPU might have from the side and from the back where the ports are located. Grab the graphics card from the bottom and gently bring it close to the top PCI slot and slide it in until you hear a click or until the clip locks in place. Please note, if you want to remove your graphics card, you have to use a sharp object, preferably a flathead, and push the tab open so that it releases your graphics card. If you don't do this and you pull out your card, you will damage and break off the locking tab. If your GPU is sagging a little bit, you can use your other hand to lift the GPU up while you tighten the thumb screws in the back. If you have any PCI-based devices like a sound card, capture card, or an SSD, you can use the same process and install this as well. Remove the PCI bracket from the back and insert your PCI device into any available PCI slot on your motherboard. Last but not least, we are ready to plug in your graphics card cables. Grab the cables labeled PCIe and plug them into the graphics card. However many pins your GPU has needs to match the PCI cables you're plugging in. As you can see, my graphics card has 2 8-pin connectors, so I'll be plugging in 2 8-pin PCI cables. Make sure to position the clip towards the lip before connecting them, and once again, make sure they are fully inserted. Alright, so this is what your PC should look like. All the components are connected and ready to go. Honestly, you guys deserve a pat on the back because this was a lot of work. I'm proud of you, but we're not done yet. We still need to install Windows, download the drivers, and the most important thing you can do for your PC, enabling XMP profile, which I'll go over later in this video. Before we work on cable management, we need to make sure that our PC boots. So go ahead and plug in the big power cable that came with the power supply in the back and switch the power supply to on. The switch indicator should be on the straight line. Go ahead and plug in your monitor to the HDMI port in the back of your graphics card along with a keyboard and mouse. Whatever you guys do, do not use a DisplayPort cable until you install the drivers. Hit the power button and stand by. If your monitor turns on and displays something, then it means your PC is working. Nicely done. You can move on to the next step. But before that, go ahead and turn the PC off by pressing the power button. If for some reason your monitor doesn't show anything, then it most likely means you forgot to plug something in. I would go back to these parts of the video one by one and watch it again. And if all else fails, we need to troubleshoot the PC. I have a great video on this, which I'll link down below. So now that we know where all the cables plug in, we can work on the cable management. Feel free to disconnect the cables and route them in any way you like so that the cable management looks nice. I recommend using lots of zip ties or Velcro straps to group the cables together, and if your case has a raceway built in, take advantage of that and route the cables through that. Once you are satisfied with the cable management, you can close off the back with the side panel. If you have a clear side panel, make sure to peel off the plastic beforehand. If your motherboard has built-in Wi-Fi, you can plug in the Wi-Fi extender from the back. Now before we turn the PC on, we need to load the operating system on a flash drive. So go ahead and find a laptop or another PC that has access to internet and plug in the flash drive into that. So go ahead and visit the Microsoft website and download the Microsoft Installation Media Tool. After it's downloaded, go ahead and launch the program and follow the on-screen instructions. Make sure to accept the terms and hit next. We're going to select the option that says Create Installation Media and then hit Next again. On this page, just make sure the correct language is selected for your country before hitting Next again. Over here, we're going to select where we want to install the operating system on. So we do have a flash drive plugged in. We're going to select the flash drive option. And on the next page, go ahead and select the flash drive that's connected to your PC and hit Next one more time. Please note that this will erase everything from your flash drive. Afterwards, just sit back and relax while Windows downloads the OS onto your drive. After it's complete, you can pull out the flash drive and move on to the next step. Okay, so now we're ready to install the operating system on your new PC. So make sure to plug in the USB drive from the back of your motherboard. Go ahead and hit the power button on your PC to turn it on. The PC will immediately recognize the flash drive and it will take you to the installation page. If you have a CD key, make sure to post it here before moving forward. However, if you don't have one, you can click on the I don't have a product key, but you will have to activate Windows sooner or later, otherwise you won't be able to use the PC properly. Wherever you guys buy your key from, just make sure you are buying the correct version. The version of your key must match the version of Windows you are installing. For example, on the next page, you have to choose what version of Windows you want to install. This version has to match the version of the key you are purchasing. I always recommend going with Windows 10 Pro, but the choice is yours. So go ahead and select the version you want to install and hit Next. Make sure to accept the license terms and hit Next again. Over here, we're going to select the custom option. This next page will show all of the drives you have connected to your PC. If you have two storage devices plugged in, you should have two options. If you're missing a storage device here, then it means you forgot to plug something in. Refer back to this section of the video to double check if you did everything correctly. As I mentioned before, I recommend installing the operating system on your fastest drive. So if you have an M.2 SSD or a regular SSD, make sure to choose those over your hard drive. You can also format your drives on this page. Select what drive you want to completely erase and click on Format. This will wipe the drive clean for a fresh start. After you select which storage device you want to install the operating system on, click on Next and wait for Windows to do its thing. This process can take a few minutes up to 30 minutes depending on how fast your storage is. The PC will restart a few times and it will eventually bring you to this page where you have to finish setting up Windows. So just go through every page and fill out the necessary information until you get to the desktop screen. Now we need to install the drivers and enable XMP profile, which is the most important thing to ensure you're not losing out on any performance. If your PC doesn't have internet access, then take out the USB drive and go find a PC or laptop that does, because we need to download the drivers onto the USB stick. We're going to open up a browser and visit your motherboard's website. Just type in the name of your motherboard on the search bar and visit the manufacturer website. Then we're going to visit the support or download section and we're going to download the following drivers if they are listed. If they're not listed, then it means your motherboard doesn't support it. Now, if you're using either an AMD CPU or an AMD graphics card, then we're going to download the Auto Detect software from AMD's page. I'll leave a link to this down below. This will automatically detect what AMD component you have and it will install the correct and updated driver for your CPU or your graphics card. If you're using an NVIDIA graphics card, you need to download and install GeForce Experience. Once again, I'll drop a link to it below. And finally, if you're using an Intel CPU, you can find the chipset driver in your motherboard support section. Once all the files are downloaded, transfer it to your USB drive and plug it in your new PC that you just built. Open the folder and transfer all the files to your desktop. Do not install the files from the USB. Sometimes it can mess up the files. So some of these are a bit tricky to install if you're new to all of this. Once you open the files, you're going to always look for the file name with the words setup on there. Double click the file and extract if necessary. And once it's done being extracted, double click on the setup file again and follow the instructions. Do this for all the files you have downloaded. You might have to restart your PC a few times during this process, but once all the drivers are installed, we are ready to enable the XMP profile. Enabling this ensures that your memory is running at its advertised speed, in which most cases brings extra performance to your PC, especially if you're on a Ryzen system. So go ahead and restart your PC and continuously hit the delete key on your keyboard until you get into the BIOS. We're going to navigate and find the section of the BIOS that says either tweaker or overclocking. You might have to go into advanced mode. It's usually F6 or F7, but it's always displayed somewhere in your BIOS. We're going to look for extreme memory profile. All you have to do is enable it and set it to profile 1. Some motherboards like Gigabyte have the option to optimize XMP. If your board has that option, make sure to enable it. Afterwards, go ahead and hit F10 and save the settings. Once you're on the desktop, we're going to make sure that XMP is enabled. So right click on your taskbar and click on Task Manager. Over here, go into Performance, then Memory. Then you should see the speed of your memory. If that matches the speed of your RAM, then you are good to go. This means that your RAM is running at its max speed. If it's showing half the speed, or if your PC crashes while enabling XMP, then you have to go back and lower the clock speed. Go back into your BIOS and click on the System Memory Multiplier. I would recommend lowering the frequency by 200 MHz. So if you're using 3600 MHz memory, I would lower it to 3400 MHz. Hit F10 and save and check your frequency again. I would do this process until you find a stable XMP setting, but if your PC keeps crashing, then it means your memory isn't on the QVL with the motherboard. In other words, it's not compatible. If that's the case, go back into your BIOS and just disable XMP profile and hit F10 to save and quit. Now let's configure your power plan. Once you're back on the desktop, click the home button and type in power plan. We're going to go ahead and click on the select a power plan option. And if you're using a Ryzen CPU, click on AMD Ryzen High Performance. If you're using an Intel CPU, click on High Performance instead, unless you have the option of enabling Ultimate High Performance Power Plan. Do that instead. If you have installed additional storage devices, you need to activate them now. So go ahead and click on the Windows Start bar and type in Partition. We're going to go ahead and select the Create and Format Hard Disk option. You should be able to see all of your storage devices on here. If any device has a black border, it means it's unallocated. In other words, it's not activated for use. We're going to right click on the drive we want to activate and click on New Simple Volume. We're going to click on Next, and over here we're going to leave everything on default and hit Next again. You can set a drive letter over here if you like. Otherwise, we're going to go hit Next again. And over here you can name your drive if you like. But just make sure to leave everything else on default before hitting next a final time. After completing these steps, the drive will become active and the black bar will turn into blue, meaning it's ready for use. You can do the same thing for any additional drive you have installed. Finally, let's set the refresh rate of your monitor. So go ahead and right click on the desktop and click on Display Settings. Scroll down and click on Advanced Display Settings, and over here select the Display Adapter Properties. Then go into the Monitor tab. If your monitor has a higher refresh rate than 60 Hz, you can change it here. So click on the drop-down menu and set it to the highest supported refresh rate and click OK. Alright, you are officially done building a PC. Congratulations, you guys. I told you it was easy, didn't I? If you thought this video was helpful, maybe consider dropping a like, as it did take me a full 3 weeks to complete, but I thank you for watching. Even if you're not building a PC, I appreciate your time. Now get out of here and enjoy your new system.
A lot of folks ask me why their dishwasher doesn't get everything clean. I tell them, it may be your detergent. That's why more dishwasher brands recommend Cascade Platinum, with the soaking, scrubbing, and rinsing built right in. For sparkling clean dishes the first time. Cascade Platinum.